In a dimly lit hut overlooking Oaxaca's mist-shrouded ravines, Maria Sabina, the famed Mazatec healer, gently fans a brazier of copal resin. Sparks drift upward like fireflies while her chant, part prayer, part diagnosis, threads the air with a rhythm older than Spanish. Tonight's midnight velada, a night-long healing vigil, unfolds at the waning moon, the hour when boundaries blur. Before her, the revered Niños Santos, psilocybin mushrooms she calls the Little Wise Ones, rest on a woven palm mat. For the Mazatec, these fungi are not curiosities, but messengers who bargain with mountain spirits. Sabina, her patient, and their kin chew the bitter caps. Mouths grow numb, candles gutter. The hut seems to inhale, walls breathe, ember shadows tilt, and a chorus of abuelos fills the silence. In this swelling vision, the mushrooms become both medicine and map, diagnosing illness and revealing humanity's thread in the cosmic weave. Sabina later told an ethnographer, "Before Wasson, nobody took the children simply to find God. We took them to set the bones of the soul." Ritual, not recreation, formed the framework that held both the experience and the community together. Entheogenic practice is a global palimpsest, each culture writing over the last with new mythic code. The Aztecs revered Teonanacatl, flesh of the gods, a Nahuatl term of veneration that Bernardino de Sahagún recorded in the Florentine Codex as central to prophecy and healing. Alarmed friars rechristened the fungi hongos diabolicos, and in Spanish inquisitorial files twisted the same phrase, now carne de los dioses, into proof of Eucharistic heresy. Codices burned by the thousands, yet jaguar-skinned pages depicting mushroom banquets survived, and during the 4-century-long silence, remote villages became living archives, whispering hymns long after church bells fell quiet. Elsewhere the pattern rhymed. Vedic poets praised Soma for giving wings to the mind, and scholars like R. Gordon Wasson and Chris Bennett now trace its chemistry to amanita or psilocybe mixed with honeymead. Across the Aegean, torchlit nights at Eleusis revolved around a cup of kykeon. Archochemical tests on helix shards reveal ergot alkaloids, a proto-LSD payload scripting a collective vision of Persephone's return. Even Stone remembers. A 16th century basalt statue of Suphilie, knees drawn and eyes sky tilted, is carved with morning glory seeds, rich in LSA and psilocybe caps, an icon frozen mid-trance. Taken together, these breadcrumbs suggest psychedelics once functioned as a cosmic bridge protocol, a ritual API letting humans ping the metaphysical server for healing, prophecy, and cosmological orientation, much as wine became Eucharistic code in Christian liturgy. When empire torches the written word, the sacrament itself endures as a portable library, its chemistry fireproof, its ritual a cipher that outlives conquest. When R. Gordon Wasson pointed Life magazine's wide-angle lens at Maria Sabina's midnight ceremony, he did far more than chronicle an obscure rite. He hit copy and paste on an entire culture. The May 1957 feature, Seeking the Magic Mushroom, landed in 7 million homes, its duotone photos filling suburban living rooms with candle smoke and Mazatec mystique. Wasson wrote, "In each acrid cap I tasted a truth older than any scripture," a line that wrapped psychedelic awe in language familiar to Sunday school ears. And because Life carried the unofficial slogan, "If it's in life, it's real," readers accepted the story as fact, not folklore. Within 72 hours, the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and Reuters ran matching pieces amplifying the claim that a humble mushroom could cure the sick and reveal the divine. Media scholars later dubbed this moment pharmacological Orientalism, the Western habit of exoticizing and extracting indigenous wisdom under the flag of science. The fallout formed a looping sequence. Curiosity sparked pilgrimage, pilgrimage invited police, police provoked more headlines, turning Huatala de Jimenez into both a psychedelic mecca and a monitored zone, a pattern that still shows how wonder and control often orbit the same flame. In the months after Life hit America's newsstands, Huatla de Jimenez morphed from secluded mountain village into a psychedelic boomtown patrolled by both backpackers and federales. Dusty mule tracks once trod by Sabina's kin, now rattled with Volkswagen vans, anthropologists in pressed khakis jostled beside bed-strung betniks and tie-dyed hitchhikers, each hunting a shortcut to revelation. Local curanderos suddenly faced competition from outsiders who spoke neither Mazatec nor the etiquette of the mushrooms, reducing centuries-old ceremony to a $5 thrill. Mexican authorities, unsettled by headlines of witch doctor drugs, deployed plainclothes officers who raided huts, seized spore jars, and interrogated elders. Within a year, Sabina, formerly Abuela de la Palabra, was recast as a narcotraficante. Neighbors, fearing collective punishment, burnt her home. "I showed them the way," she said, "and they brought only fear." This pattern followed a familiar chain reaction. Fascination sparked an influx of seekers. The influx bred moral panic, and moral panic culminated in prohibition. And while Sabina's candle sputtered in Huatla, another flame, neon bright and laboratory clean, was already flickering 9,000 kilometers away. Basel, 1938. In the vaulted chemistry halls of Sandoz, 32-year-old Albert Hofmann tinkered with ergot alkaloids, hoping to improve blood circulation drugs. Compound number 25, lysergic acid dithylamide, showed no animal effect and was archived. 5 years later, Hofmann felt what he called a peculiar presentiment and resynthesized the molecule. On 16th of April 1943, he absorbed a trace amount, unwittingly inaugurating what chemists now celebrate as Bicycle Day. During his pedal ride home, colors fractured, sounds gained shapes, and the boundaries of the self dissolved into a kaleidoscopic tide, not unpleasant, yet utterly transformative. In a single afternoon, the ergot fungus that once caused medieval St. Anthony's fire had yielded the most powerful hallucinogen known to science, and relocated the doorway to the sacred, from Sabina's adobe hut to a Swiss fume hood. While the embers of Sabina's burnt hut still glowed in Huatla, Hofmann's crystalline molecules began its own pilgrimage. Sandoz, entranced by his Bicycle Day notes, patented LSD as Delcid in 1947 and shipped thumb-sized vials to psychiatrists with an audacious instruction: first take it yourself. From Basel, the ampoules fanned outward like dandelion seeds, to Zurich's Bergoli Clinic, to London's Maudsley, to the red brick wings of Weyburn Mental Hospital on the Canadian Prairie. There, Humphrey Omsmond and Abraham Hoffer staged a simple experiment, one guided LSD session for chronic alcoholics. In their 1953 report, almost half the patients stayed sober for months. One ward boasted 90% abstinence after a single visionary night. Across the Atlantic at Powick Hospital in Worcestershire, psychiatrists found that a lone 200 microgram journey could yank patients from catatonic depression faster than weeks of electroshock or barbiturates. By the mid-1950s, more than 1,000 papers and 40,000 patient sessions would trumpet LSD as psychiatry's most promising frontier. Headlines followed the data. Life hailed LSD as a mind-expanding marvel, placing it beside penicillin and insulin in the pantheon of wonder drugs, while Time dubbed it a psychic scalpel. The term mind-manifesting, psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond plain English gloss on his new word psychedelic, quickly migrated from medical journals to mainstream columns. The New York Times ran Sunday features on miracle cures emerging from Zurich and Saskatchewan, and Hollywood icon Cary Grant told reporters that his private Delcid sessions were a voyage into myself that sandblasted my neuroses. For a brief electric moment, it seemed the world had found a chemical lantern bright enough to light the psyche's darkest corners. But every lantern casts a shadow. Between 1957 and 1961, the thalidomide tragedy left more than 10,000 children with severe birth defects, shattering public faith in pharmaceutical miracles. The US responded with the 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments, mandating proof of efficacy and sweeping liability. At the same time, newsreels showed West Coast acid tests where Ken Kesey splashed LSD into Kool-Aid under whirling strobe lights, proof to regulators that the genie had bolted the laboratory. Facing sensational headlines, tightening laws, and the specter of ruinous lawsuits, Sandoz quietly recalled its remaining Delcid ampoules in 1965, citing protection of patient welfare. The pipeline that once promised a revolution in healing now ran dry, and a compound born in a Swiss lab slipped into the shadows of the underground culture. The moment Sandoz tightened the spigot, the molecule changed hands and costume. Vials that once sat in locked hospital fridges now slid across coffee tables in Cambridge apartments and San Francisco lofts, migrating through jazz clubs, art schools, and the crackling circuitry of the nascent folk rock scene. By the dawn of the 1960s, what began as hushed laboratory inquiry has metastasized into a full-color social beta test, thousands of private experiments running in parallel, none subject to double-blind protocols, all feeding a cultural mainframe suddenly hungry for transcendence. If the 1950s spoke in the muted hues of lab coats and peer review, the 1960s detonated in Technicolor. Tie-dye spirals, black light posters, liquid light projectors, all visual shorthand for an interior cinema newly accessible to anyone with a blotter tab. The wisdom Mazatec and Hucul shamans had guarded for centuries now echoed through Berkeley lecture halls and Greenwich Village coffee houses. The mind is editable, perception negotiable, society a draft in need of a revision. Psychedelics became the era's open source firmware, inviting users to jailbreak inherited reality. Beat oracle Allen Ginsberg hailed LSD as a key to smash the steel bars of habitual perception, while Aldous Huxley in the 1957 letter to Humphrey Osmond coined psychedelic, bequeathing the movement its definitive brand. Within a single cultural heartbeat, the genie was not merely out of the bottle, it was painting murals on the bottle, wiring it with feedback speakers and inviting the neighborhood to an all-night light show. In San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, storefronts once selling hardware now hawked incense and Indian print bedspreads, patchouli threaded through the air while block-long banners declared love is all you need. A few time zones east, London's UFO club bathed dancers in oil slide projections as Pink Floyd, fresh off recording The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, translated lysergic visions into echo chamber guitar. Back in the American Northwest, abandoned lumber camps morphed into Oregon communes where ex-grad students tilled kale by day and shared smuggled Mexican mushrooms by night, beta testing economies of gift rather than profit. Each node, Hyde Street corner, Soho basement, Cascadian pasture, functioned like a live code branch of the same cultural repository, syncing updates via word of mouth, mimeography, and vinyl grooves. Yet the psychedelic explosion was more than a burst of swirling colors. One strong dose could pry open the public imagination. College students returned from 12-hour journeys questioning the wisdom of nuclear stockpiles. Suburban teens swamped lawnmower jobs for meditation cushions, and draft-age men burnt their selective service cards, declaring that no government could conscript a mind it had not made. Environmental historian Theodore Roszak later noted that LSD let people feel the warnings of the limits to growth report long before policymakers paid attention. Communal kitchens, consensus circles, and early eco-villages took root, weaving a gentle web of influence that unsettled traditional power. The molecule worked like a solvent, dissolving Cold War either-ors, East versus West, capitalism versus communism, obedience versus dissent. Where generals spoke of deterrence, the newly initiated sensed interdependence, an anti-authoritarian spirit now on a collision course with the geopolitical status quo. Timothy Leary stepped into this kaleidoscopic cauldron as both oracle and arsonist. A decade earlier, he had lectured on personality metrics at Harvard. By 1963, he was leading candlelit sessions in Cambridge attics, declaring LSD a cognitive Rosetta Stone. His mantra, turn on, tune in, drop out, wasn't a summons to apathy, but a three-step protocol. Turn on later neural circuitry with psychedelics. Tune in to the ecological and social signal beneath capitalist noise. Drop out of prefabricated life paths to prototype alternatives. In 1961, Leary and his colleague Richard Alpert, later Ram Dass, carried LSD behind the walls of Concord State Prison in Massachusetts. Over several months, they led 32 inmates, each nearing parole, through high-dose sessions framed by meditation and follow-up circles. 6 months after release, only a quarter had returned to custody, roughly 40% below the prison's usual recidivism rate. The sample was small and later contested, yet neurologists still view the project as an early sign that a single deep insight experience can rewrite entrenched behavior, the same logic that underpins today's neuroplasticity therapies. Leary called LSD a cognitive catalyst, anticipating the modern language of mental health resets and our culture's recurring urge for a digital detox. His ambitions didn't stop at therapy. Leary drafted a psychedelic curriculum proposing that grade schoolers learn geometry through synesthetic art, while college seniors undertook guided trips as capstones in self-knowledge, an idea oddly consonant with contemporary VR immersion labs. In lectures, he outlined transcendental game theory, arguing that high-dose sessions could rewire zero-sum competitive reflexes into cooperative problem-solving, conceptual scaffolding for the crowdsourced hackathons of the 21st century tech scene. Broadcasting cosmic jazz over Harvard's WHRB radio and mimeographing trippy manifestos, he became mimetic superspreader. Declassified FBI memos from 1968 list him as a Tier 1 subversive influence. Leary's legacy is therefore a Mobius strip. On one side, he showed that psychedelics could reboot both personal trauma and collective worldview, a spark that decades later would ignite research at Johns Hopkins and Imperial College. On the flip, his carnival at press stunts, gubernatorial runs, and space migration sermons framed LSD as cultural nitroglycerin, prompting Richard Nixon to brand him the most dangerous man in America, and helping lawmakers lock the drug into Schedule 1 by 1970. He embodied the core dialectic of the psychedelic saga, visionary possibility provoking reactive prohibition, a pendulum swinging from Swiss lab to Senate hearing, and at last, back toward today's clinical renaissance. By the mid-1960s, psychedelics had become inseparable from the era's defining conflicts, anti-war protests, civil rights marches, and the generational revolt against Cold War orthodoxies. In conservative eyes, LSD users were not mere bohemians, but ideological saboteurs, young draft-age men rejecting service in Vietnam, where between 1964 and 1973, some 2.2 million Americans were conscripted. For many, a few acid-laden sessions crystallized the absurdity of sending their classmates to die in a pointless war, fueling draft card burnings, draft board raids, and exoduses to Canada. Meanwhile, black activists pointed out the glaring hypocrisy. Psychedelics vilified as mind poisons, even as amphetamines were issued to combat troops to keep them fighting, revealing a racialized double standard in drug policy. By 1968, campus sit-ins and clandestine mushroom veladas sat side by side with SDS teach-ins and Black Panther rallies, all under the pall of America's most unpopular war. To Nixon's inner circle, LSD was a two-edged threat. It fueled draft card burnings, by some estimates over 300,000 notices destroyed between 1965 and 71, and it sounded a clarion call for interracial solidarity that risked emptying the ranks of frontline troops. Behind closed doors, the strategy was laid bare. As John Erckleman later confessed, the Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or black people, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. In congressional hearings on youth unrest, legislators lumped LSD in with marijuana, ignoring its clinical pedigree, and pressed for unified controls. When Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, LSD was cast into Schedule 1 alongside heroin and peyote, deemed to have no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Overnight, authorities gained a new cudgel: police raids on communes, rock venues and private gatherings, mass arrests of long-haired troublemakers, and the stark ultimatum that one either rallied behind the nation's battles or dropped out of the game altogether. What began as fear for the youth's moral fiber had swiftly mutated into a mechanism of social control, an acid test for loyalty in an era defined by war and dissent. Amid this domestic turmoil, another layer of the story was playing out in the shadows, one fueled by Cold War paranoia and espionage intrigue. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles quietly authorized Project MKUltra, an immense $10 million plus secret effort to weaponize psychochemicals in the Cold War fight for minds. Over the next decade, the agency funneled LSD into more than 30 universities, hospitals, and prisons, testing it on soldiers, mental hospital patients, and unwitting civilians. A 1977 Senate report later revealed that MKUltra ranked among the CIA's largest ever clandestine endeavors, with Sidney Gottlieb's poisoner-in-chief staff running sub-projects from radiological implants to hypnosis alongside LSD trials. MK's Ultra most infamous sub-project, Operation Midnight Climax, turned San Francisco brothels into spy labs. Women recruited as CIA informants lured clients back to safe houses, and these men, unaware they'd been dosed, were filmed through one-way mirrors while their every reaction was recorded. Such covert dosing flagrantly violated the Nuremberg Code's prohibition on non-consensual human experimentation, marking a profound ethical rupture in American intelligence history. Declassified memos even giddily noted LSD's capacity to erode the subject's ego mechanisms, language more fitting to psychological warfare than medicine. In a twist of historical irony, MK Ultra's clandestine trials helped ignite the very movement the CIA would later crush. Ken Kesey, then a night aide at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital, first inhaled the acid mystique in a 1959 MK Ultra-linked study on psychoactives. He carried that experience into the Merry Pranksters acid tests, transforming government-sponsored labs into communal rituals of liberation. LSD, initially a Trojan horse for mind control, slipped free, spreading through college campuses, artistic circles, and eventually into the Haight-Ashbury streets. By the late 1960s, the US had erected a three-layer quarantine around the psychedelic frontier. Layer 1, the 1966 Drug Abuse Control Amendments, hastily drafted after MK Ultra headlines exposed CIA acid capers, and Look magazine splashed LSD, Nightmare or Miracle, across grocery checkouts. Layer 2, a patchwork of state bans that made possession a felony from Texas to New York within 18 months. Layer 3, and most lethal, the 1970 Controlled Substances Act, which entombed LSD and psilocybin in Schedule 1 as agents with no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. Big Pharma, still reeling from thalidomide lawsuits and unable to patent a 1943 molecule, slammed its lab books shut. Sandoz destroyed remaining Delicide stocks. Even the CIA pivoted, shelving LSD for the more controllable deliriant BZ-EA2277, because as one memo put it, subject is incapacitated without philosophical side effects. What began as a covert search for a truth serum ended as a pharmacological orphanage, a class of compounds abandoned by science, outlawed by law, and mythologized by the street. On an overcast January morning, delegates from 17 nations filed into a draughty hall on Vienna's Ringstrasse. No candles, no velvet, only flickering fluorescents, translation headsets, and waist-high stacks of briefing papers stamped urgent, CND-24-4. Their brief: draft a single treaty to police the world's proliferating mind-altering compounds. After 5 days of speeches about youth psychosis, national security, and moral hygiene, the gavel fell on the UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances. LSD, DMT, mescaline, and psilocybin were placed in Schedule 1, stricter than morphine or cocaine, effectively issuing a global death certificate for the psychedelic renaissance. If the century-long conflict over altered states was a war for the cultural soul, Vienna 1971 was its decisive artillery strike, a bureaucratic exorcism of ecstatic consciousness carried out under humming neon instead of church incense. Ancient sacraments were indicated in absentia. The doors of perception were padlocked with multilateral signatures and rubber stamps. The old guard had won, for the moment on the grandest stage available, an irony not lost on the few observers who remembered that every signature banning the mushroom was itself inked with the same human curiosity the ban sought to suppress. One can view the 1971 convention as a dry legal instrument, scheduling substances into categories, mandating member states to outlaw them. But beneath that technocratic veneer lies the culmination of a profound cultural and ideological struggle. In effect, the convention declared that the ancient allies of humankind's spiritual explorations were now enemies of public welfare worldwide. Substances like LSD, DMT, mescaline, and psilocybin were placed in Schedule 1, reserved for those chemicals deemed to pose a serious risk to public health, and to have no therapeutic value in the eyes of authorities. They were classified alongside synthetic amphetamines and pharmaceutical diversions, but unlike most lab-made drugs, these psychedelics had rich histories of medicinal and ritual use. No matter the treaty, Schedule 1 imposed the strictest controls possible. As a contemporary UN bulletin noted with some pride, LSD, mescaline, etc. are controlled in a way which is more stringent than morphine under the narcotics treaties. Morphine, heroin, cocaine, dangerous though they were, at least had recognized medical roles, such as pain relief, and were scheduled accordingly. But the psychedelics were afforded no such acknowledgement of their potential benefits. Under Article 7 of the 1971 Convention, governments agreed that LSD and its cousins could only be produced or used for very limited scientific or medical purposes, and any international trade required special government authorization, tighter even than for opioids. Essentially, the world slammed shut the legal door on these substances, locking them out of sight. It is illuminating to consider how the delegates justified this extreme stance. Official UN records from 1968 show that the impetus came from panic-stricken reports about youth consuming LSD. The UN Economic and Social Council cited serious damage to health being caused by LSD and similar hallucinogenic substances, and urged nations to restrict them to research only. The subtext was clear. The unchecked spread of psychedelics, especially among young people, was seen as a public health emergency and a threat to social order. There was little mention in these discussions of the positive research from the 50s or the millennia of indigenous use. Instead, the focus was on containing a cultural contagion. American diplomats, spurred by Nixon's newly declared war on drugs, announced in 1971 with a focus on making the world free of drug abuse, took a leading role in pushing this international agenda. To many in power, psychedelics had become synonymous with chaos, tied to student protests, draft dodging, and a breakdown in traditional values. The global ban can thus be seen as the establishment's decisive strike in an ideological battle, a reassertion of control over not just substances, but narratives and norms. As pens sign the Vienna Convention documents, one can imagine an unseen echo across time, the sighs of relief from those forces that had long sought to exorcise the psychedelic demons from society. The treaty was more than paperwork, it was symbolism. Just as the medieval church once condemned heretical texts and pagan rites, the modern secular authorities were condemning and expelling a whole class of visionary experience from legitimate culture. The journey from Sacrament to Schedule 1 was complete. The sacred mushrooms that Mazatec shamans prayed over, the divine cactus that generations of Native American peyotists consumed in all-night teepee ceremonies, the mystical LSD that Western seekers thought might transform humanity. All of these were now officially branded as illicit, dangerous, without redeeming value. A chapter of history closed with a resounding slam, marked by the thud of rubber stamps and the clink of jail cell doors. So, in the span of a few decades, humanity's relationship with psychedelics had inverted. That which was once holy medicine became contraband. What was a path to enlightenment became a pathway to prison. Yet this dramatic turning point raises lingering questions that no law or treaty can fully answer. What does it mean to outlaw a state of consciousness? To criminalize not just a plant or a chemical, but the experience it triggers and the ideas that experience might inspire? In the final analysis, the war on psychedelics was never just about public health or safety. It was and still remains a war over worldviews and who gets to shape them. One might offer a novel metaphor. Consider consciousness as a vast wild landscape full of valleys of mundane thought, and here and there mountains of visionary insight. Indigenous cultures saw psychedelics as trails up those mountains, sometimes challenging or perilous, yes, but ultimately leading to exalted vistas of understanding. The modern prohibition in this metaphor was like building a barbed wire fence at the foot of the mountain and posting armed guards to turn back any would-be climbers. The message was clear. That realm is forbidden, those peaks are off limits. The authorities claimed it was for our own good, to prevent people from falling off cliffs, a real concern to be fair, but in doing so they also denied society at large the heights of what those experiences might offer. They attempted in essence to legislate the boundaries of the human mind. Yet, history has a way of looping back on itself. Even as the ink dried on the 1971 convention, the cultural reverberations of psychedelics persisted in art, literature, and underground practice. The knowledge was never truly erased, it went into hiding, like a seed beneath winter snow waiting for more favorable conditions to sprout. Indigenous communities continued their ceremonies in private. Psychonaut mystics in the West kept the flame alive quietly, exchanging photocopies of banned books and furtive whispers of personal insight. Decades later, a new generation of scientists and doctors would gingerly reopen the case files on these outlawed substances, asking if perhaps something of value had been lost in the fray. Indeed, in recent years we've seen a renaissance of research into psilocybin for depression, or MDMA, a related and pathogenic drug for PTSD, suggesting that the no medical use verdict may have been premature. On a more philosophical level, the psychedelic saga forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that illegality is sometimes a product of fear, not just facts. Psychedelics were made illegal not solely because of pharmacology, but because of what they symbolized. They were catalysts for counterculture, mirrors held up to society's flaws, and tools that allowed individuals to experience mystical states outside of sanctioned religious frameworks. In short, they challenged power, the power of governments, of established churches, of cultural hegemony. As one commentator put it, of all the things that can alter consciousness, the most dangerous is an idea. Psychedelics in chemical form carry ideas within them, or rather, they reliably provoke idea-generating experiences in human minds. Some of those ideas, interconnectedness of all life, the arbitrariness of certain social conventions, were deeply subversive to the dominant paradigm of the mid-20th century. Thus, the move to ban psychedelics globally can be seen as the climax of a culture war, an attempt by the guardians of one reality to stamp out the portals to other realities. In the end, this epic tale leaves us with a poetic irony and a hint of hope. The irony is that the very act of prohibition mythologized psychedelics even more, making them forbidden fruit only amplified their allure to some and confirmed their dangers to others, cementing their symbolic power either way. The hope lies in the notion that truth, like consciousness, tends to surface eventually. Modern humanity may yet find a synthesis, a way to honor the ancient wisdom of these substances, while respecting the genuine risks they pose. As we reflect on this journey from the sacred to the illicit, we might recall that Maria Sabina's beloved Niños Santos, the mushroom spirits, were said to impart lessons about healing, balance, and respect. Those lessons didn't vanish when the UN passed a resolution. Picture a final scene, not a dramatic burn or a UN vote, but a quiet one. An old shaman in the mountains, sitting by a fire, grinding dry mushrooms into a powder, singing a song that her grandmother's grandmother taught her. Outside, the night sky is bursting with stars. The world around her has labeled her sacred medicine a crime. Yet in that, she carries on, custodian of a knowledge older than any law. In her mind, there is no such thing as illegal consciousness. There are only states of mind that one must approach with reverence and caution. And perhaps that is the crux of it. Reverence and caution, the two things most absent in the frenzy of criminalization. As the fire crackles, one can almost hear the voices of the mushrooms in her song, whispering that someday understanding will come full circle. The cycle will turn, what was sacred may be sacred again, when humanity remembers that the quest for transcendence is as much a part of us as the need for shelter or the need for love. In closing, the global criminalization of psychedelics was not merely the banning of chemicals, but the suppression of a facet of the human spirit. It was as if society put the soul on trial and pronounced certain explorations of inner space verboten. But the spirit, like water, finds cracks to flow through. In the grand timeline of humanity, the decades of prohibition might one day be seen as a brief dam that cannot hold back the deeper currents of curiosity and yearning for meaning. The story of psychedelics is still unfolding, an interplay of darkness and illumination, fear and awe. And as we step forward, perhaps carrying both the cautionary tales and the profound possibilities, we are challenged to reframe how we think about illegality, consciousness, and ritual. Rather than a war to be won, the psychedelic experience might be a conversation to be had between the ancient and the modern, the sacred and the rational, the individual and the society. In that dialogue, conducted with open eyes and open minds, we may yet find a resolution more nuanced and wise than the blunt force of prohibition. The third act of this saga is still being written, and it invites us all to ponder, can you truly outlaw a journey within, or will the vision find its way, as vision always does, to those prepared to see?